Paul was a really multifaceted individual and complicated, but multifaceted in some of his likes and in his interest in life.
I had a wonderful time connecting with today's guest. Thank you to Galen McCormick, the ISB president-elect, for the introduction. Turns out we have a lot in common. I think we had just a wonderful conversation. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we're talking today with Michael Fanelli, who is a bassist, an educator, a musicologist, and is known for being a proponent of the teachings of Paul Rolland. And Paul has been somebody on my mind for years and years. I've learned a lot from various clinics about Paul Rolland. Michael will get into it and describe it much more eloquently than me. But Paul Rolland was a string educator, and especially in the state of Illinois, where I lived for many years, Paul was active in Illinois, and so his teachings have been adopted there, but also widely throughout the United States and the world. But bass players, not so much. Michael has been wonderful at taking Paul's teachings and making them work for the bass. We get into that, Michael's backstory, and much more. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Quick shout out to our sponsors, Upton Bass and Ear Trumpet Labs. More on them later. And here we go with this conversation with Michael Fanelli. Where are you located exactly?
I'm located in Northeast Iowa. I taught for a number of years at the University of Northern Iowa, and that's probably about 90 miles north of the University of Iowa. I don't know if that gives you any. If you know where Dubuque is, we're about 90 miles west of Dubuque. It's like what George Clooney said. It's a geographic anomaly, something or other.
Well, so are you in the driftless zone kind of area in Iowa that be like kind of near the Mississippi, that kind of Galena?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're that area there, and the glacier is actually obviously we're by the Mississippi River, and if you go farther east, you get into the Great River Road, and it's beautiful to fall, and you have all the bluffs and everything else. It's just gorgeous.
Well, I think of
that. There's a lot of rolling plains and so on.
I think of that
your
as
corn and all your other thing comes from here.
Well, I think of that as one of the best kept secrets of that part of the Midwest. Like I lived in Chicago for a long time, but I'm from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and so I discovered, I would usually drive I-90, but I discovered at some point a much more pleasant route was to go through Galena and take the Great River Road, and it's such an incredible, yeah.
I really love it. I remember one time I was coming back with my wife from Chicago, and we stopped in Galena. It was right before Christmas, and it had just lightly dusted snow. And we went to this restaurant that was on a hill overlooking Galena. When I came out, it looked like one of those lighted toy villages. It was just enchanting.
Mm-hmm.
No, I know they say, I was a fly-by state and everything. But there's a lot of really beautiful, as you well know, from South Dakota and that, land here. And the other thing I think that's really interesting, there's a lot of young people that are coming in here that are really entrepreneurial, that are just doing many, many different things. So it's more vibrant than people sometimes stereotype it as it is.
Oh, for sure. Well, my wife played harp for the Des Moines Metro Opera for 5 seasons. Oh, yeah. And so I spent 5 summers. I played 1 season and then just hung out with her the other season. So I spent a lot of time in Indianola, Iowa. And then I grew up, Sioux Falls is on the Iowa border. So I played for a few years in the Sioux City Symphony, and then Sioux Center even, which is a real small area on that side of the state. So other side of the state. But I've spent a lot of time in Iowa. I love it. I have an aunt and uncle in Mason City, Iowa, and
well, I went up one year to judge with several people the Lucy Weed competition up in Yankton, and it was a lovely reception for the people up there, and obviously Tom Brokaw's from there and everything else like that. But I just enjoyed it. I really found it very interesting to go to that part of the state. And when I'm referring to that because there were a lot of people that lived in Yankton that went down and played in the Sioux City Symphony or went over wherever.
Well, yeah. I love that. I haven't thought of the Lucy Weed competition in decades. I won that competition. I was one of the in like 1992 or 1993 or something like that.
So, what did you play?
Oh boy, I'd have to let me see. I probably played the. Let's see. I had been studying with Jeff Bradisich in the summers at Northwestern, and so I think I had learned the Moses Fantasy. So I probably played the Moses Fantasy and maybe Romanian folk dance, one of the slow movement. I forget the name of what, but that's probably what I played. That was what I was doing back in the time.
I was really amazed at the level of players that came through there and bass players. I don't remember his name, but there was one bass player in the first round that came up and did the Allegro Appassionato. It was just phenomenal. We just sat there, and when we got through, the judges and I just looked at each other, which was not supposed to, but raised our eyebrows like, wow, So it was a lot of fun, and the people are just great, just so hospitable and everything. It was wonderful.
Well, you have
there's a couple of Midwest boys here, guys talking.
Well, I love it. I so rarely get to talk with people about that area of the country, but I was just back in South Dakota last week visiting Mom.
Right.
I'm actually going to South Dakota again in a few days to do a teacher in service with the Sioux Falls Public School.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I love it, and there were back in the late '80s, early '90s when I was studying, there were a couple of great bass teachers in South Dakota. There was a bassist named Charles Kreitzer, Chuck Kreitzer, he had studied, I think, in Colorado and was also a luthier as well. And so I bought my first bass from him. I took lessons with him. Right. I believe, oh boy, I'm forgetting, but there was a great bass teacher in Watertown, South Dakota named Ole Nelson or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but he had several bass players come through and have gone on to play. Right. And then we weren't, you're not too far from Minneapolis at that point. So I would go and take lessons with some Minnesota orchestra bass players and James Clute,
James Clute I know because I studied with Benfield and Clute was a Benfield student.
That's right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of connections there, and then there's what's his name? Michael John Smith, who's a luthier up there, also has played in the St. Paul. I think I don't know if he played in the St. Paul Chamber. I think he played in the opera, and I think he played at times in the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. And his wife, I don't plays bassoon. But no, there's a lot of wonderful things. We have a regional orchestra, of course, with the pandemic. Things have been shut down, but the Waterloo Cedar Falls Symphony, and it's interesting. A number of the people that travel in come in from probably there's several from Chicago that had come in, and I'm not playing it anymore, and several came in from Minneapolis and so on the last week that, to augment the sections and everything. So, yeah, there's a lot going on, and it's great.
Yeah, well, and I knew several players in the Chicago area. You're in eastern Iowa, that area. You're close enough that it's like a reasonable drive if you stay overnight. And yeah, it's a cool part of the country. It's been interesting the last 6 years. Been living out here in California. I have no, this is not home. That where you're from is more home to me than this. But it's been fun to say goodbye to the winter for a few years.
Right. Well, it's interesting because when I met my wife when I was teaching down at the University of Missouri in Columbia, she was living in San Francisco, and I went up there, and she had this beautiful apartment, and with the picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I remember I looked at her, I said, "You must really love me if you're leaving this view." It was just terrific. So, no, but I know it was great. So, anyways.
Yeah, that's great. Now it's funny. It's funny what you get used to, though. Every day I walk by the Golden Gate Bridge. That's my daily walk with the dog. And for the first couple of weeks, I was thinking, I can't believe I'm doing this. Every single day. And now it's just like I could be walking by, at the mall or something. I'm just so used to it.
I know we get somewhat acclimated,
Yeah.
and it's part of our daily life. Yeah.
Well,
Great.
I love that you know Joanne May and Zach and Samantha, and I've known Joanne for years. She and I, it's what a small world it is, Michael. Because so about a year ago, Joanne May and Joanne Irwin and Samantha and I started doing a series of videos about teaching beginners Paul Rolland technique. Now, one of those people, that's me, doesn't know that much about Rolland. So what would happen was Joanne Irwin would film the videos, and then I would watch her cello videos and sort of interpret for bass. And then I've been to many clinics over the years with Joanne May about Paul Rolland, and I've watched the video. I mean, I've learned a lot, and I think being an orchestra teacher in Illinois, you kind of absorb that.
Sure.
But I think it's something that maybe not as many, he's a name that is just not as top of mind as like Suzuki, though I think his influence is massive. And I've always been interested in exploring like Rolland on bass, like how that applies to bass, because I've had to interpret like the case walk and, all these different things,
Sure.
So I'm thankful to Galen for introducing us, and
thank you.
Yeah, it's just,
I am too.
Yeah, so I don't even know where to start. We could talk about whatever, but how did you get introduced to Rolland?
Well, I met Rolland. Interestingly enough, I started playing the violin when I was 7 years old, and I was playing till about 11. And my father was a very fine pianist, a classical pianist, but a phenomenal jazz musician. But he would play organ at the church that we were going to at the time. And they were having a Christmas concert, and they were doing a mass, a midnight mass at Pietro Yon. And so he had members of the Chicago Symphony, I think a quintet, come in because it would call for strings. And I asked him if I could just sit in and listen. So I did. And he said, you just need to be very quiet. So I happened to be sitting next to the bass player. And I think the bass player actually was Robert Fassbender, who was Rudolf Fassbender's son, which I eventually studied with anyways. And I sat next to the bass, and it was like somebody just grabbed me by the collar and said, this is the instrument you should be playing. I just was so taken with the sound of the bass. Of course, Robert was a terrific player too, but I mean, it just spoke to me, like because I hadn't really thought about being a violinist. I was really interested in architecture at that point, and I was thinking maybe I'd go into being an architect, and it just spoke to me like, the feeling when it's like meeting something, a person or something. There's an instantaneous connection. So about a month later, at dinner, I asked my father if I could play the bass, and he looked at me and like, where did you get such a strange idea? But anyways, to make a long story short, he did say, okay, I'll let you start on the bass, but you still have to continue your lessons on the violin, because I was studying with a really fine violinist in the Chicago Symphony at the time, Perry Crafton. So I got a bass, a K bass, and it came with 10 lessons from this music shop. And I went in and I was taking the lessons, and I didn't realize it, but the teacher that was teaching was a guitar teacher, and he was teaching me guitar positions on the bass. Well, what happened was that a bow came with it, but I wasn't being taught to do the bow, but it was a French bow at the time. And I just started picking up, and I was looking at the tech book I had. I think it was some book. It wasn't Samandel. It was a book like from Chubby Jackson or something. I mean, it was a sort of a popular book anyways. And my father heard me, I guess, scraping away, if you want to call for a better term. And he said, are you interested in learning to play with the bow? And I said, yes. And so he said, well, if you're going to do this, he said, we're going to have to make a decision about the violin or the bass. And he said, are you really serious about the bass? And I said, yes. So he said, then I want to get you a really good teacher. And the teacher he got me was that set me up with was Rudolf Fassbender, who was a legendary teacher in Chicago. And he taught in the Fine Arts Building. I think it was the 727 was the room. I remember that. And I went in for a lesson, and I started playing for him. He said, "Show me what he did." He just started howling and laughing, and my father said, "What's basically so funny?" He said, "Well, he's playing guitar positions on the bass." That's how we started off, and how I met Rolland is that year I started playing the bass right before Christmas or in November. The following spring. He said, "You really need to be in an orchestra," because I was in a parochial school at the time. They had no instrumental music, anything at all. So there was a famous teacher. She was just phenomenal. Had a youth orchestra program in Jefferson Park. Her name was Fanny Hassler. I don't know if you heard her. Have you ever heard of her?
I haven't. No, I know Jefferson Park, of course.
It's a whole history in itself. Anyway, so I was there for about a year playing in the orchestra, and she said, "You really should go to a summer camp." And I said, "Okay, well, where should I go?" And she said, "How about the Illinois Summer Youth Music?" And she knew Paul Rolland really well. And that's how I met him. And it was a funny story because the first week I was there, I was kept late for my bass lesson. And I ended up going to lunch when everybody else was gone. And I was sitting there, and it was air conditioned. I was by a window and everything. And I heard a tray across the table from me. And I look up, and there's Paul Rolland. And I knew who Paul Rolland was because my father knew a number of people on the faculty at the University of Illinois. And he asked me if he could sit down with me. And I was sort of stunned. Anyways, we had this great conversation for a half hour, and I felt sort of sheepish. I don't know why, but I finally admitted I had played the violin, but I was going to be a bass player. And he said, he was really nice and wonderful. He said, "Well, we need bass players in the orchestras and everything else." And then he looked over at me and he said, "Now make sure you're a good one." So anyways, that's how it started off. And then I went to the summer camp for the next 3 or 4 years. And then what happened as I was playing, started in high school, to make a long that shorter, there was a French bow there, and I started fooling around with that, though I was still playing German bow with Fassbender. And I asked Rudolph if I could, he'd teach me French bow. He says, "No, I don't teach French bow." So I waited about another year because I really loved him, and he was a very demanding teacher. He insisted I practice at least an hour to an hour and a half a day. We were going through the Samanda Book 1, which there were some exercises I like, as you well know, and others that were just, very sterile. But anyways, I finally told him one day, I said, "Isn't there anything else more interesting?" So he started me on the 30, etudes of Samanda Book. And that really made me, I really got into that. So finally, I really wanted to play French bow. And it wasn't that I didn't think the German bow was a good bow or anything like that. It was just I felt, because of my arms and that, more comfortable. And I was watching, as a freshman, some of my classmates who were playing French bow, and one of them showed me how to basically hold it in that. And he said, "Well, if you want to play French bow, you need to go to a French bow teacher." And so basically he hooked me up with Roran Benfield. That's how that started. And so, but Benfield also was a great friend of Starker, who was also a very close associate to Rolland. So it's a small world, as we said. And so I sort of got into that circle, and a lot of the things that Starker did, Benfield adapted, I should say, and played. In fact, Starker mentions that in his biography. And also, of course, Murray Grodner did a lot with Starker's approach. So that's how I got involved with that. And then finally, when it was time to go to college, I had to think about whether I was going to go to Northwestern, which Bourne wanted me to do, but it was really expensive, even with the scholarships. And so Illinois was attractive. Professor Krolik, who taught there, actually had graduated from Eastman and had worked with Oscar Zimmerman, who also was connected with Torello as well as Benfield. And then I basically couldn't make my mind. And then one day I went for a lesson with Benfield, and who comes out of the house with his bass is Edward Krolik. And I found out that he had been working with him. So I talked to Benfield about him. I talked to him about my financial thing, and that's how that went. And I went down to Illinois, and it was a much more less expensive. But it was interesting. Benfield and Krolik had a phenomenal relationship. And so when I would come back to Chicago, I'd go take lessons with Warren, and Ed had no issue with that at all. And so in the meantime, when I was down there, I needed to make money because I basically set myself through college. So I talked to Krolik, and Krolik says, I'll see what I can do. So he got me a work study sort of like program into a program where I ended up working in the string annex and being sort of a gopher and doing all this stuff and working for Rolland. And that's how that relationship started.
I'm so happy that my course, Beginners Classical Bass, is out in the world on Discover Double Bass, and we've been getting some great feedback. Here's Barry Green, instructor of bass at The Ohio State University, former principal bassist of the Cincinnati Symphony, and author of The Inner Game of Music. Barry writes about the course. This wonderful, extensive course includes 14 chapters of 66 lessons, varying in length from 1 to 8 minutes each. It is so comprehensive. While it is called a beginner's course, this only means that the course begins with the parts of the instrument, including how to take the bass out of the case. However, it also takes the player through the most advanced left and right hand techniques, including shifting, pivoting, harmonics, positions up to the thumb position, tuning the bass, scales and arpeggios, as well as left hand techniques of dynamics, bow placement, articulations, including portato, staccato, and slurring. Barry, thank you so much. And folks, if you haven't checked it out, you can find it through the link in the show notes or just visit discoverdoublebase.com/Jason Heath. This episode is brought to you by Ear Trumpet Labs. They make hand-built mics out of Portland, Oregon, and they have an excellent mic for upright bass called Nadine. The Nadine is a condenser mic with a clear, natural sound and incredible feedback rejection. This mic is a completely new design. The head mounts in between the strings above the tailpiece with a rubber grommet, and the body securely straps to the tailpiece with Velcro elastic. A 14-inch Mogami cable connects the two parts, making it easy to place on any bass. It's durable and holds up to the demanding needs of the instrument while offering excellent sound quality. Ear Trumpet Labs is offering a free t-shirt just for Contrabass Conversations listeners with the purchase of a mic. Just visit www.eartrumpetlabs.com/contrabass to claim yours and check out the Nadine.
Wow. Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
So many shared connections. You know, I never studied with Warren. I think we emailed about this. I never studied with Warren Benfield, but I have so many colleagues and people I know that, and he continued to teach for a long time, even after he'd retired officially from teaching. I knew people in the late 90s, early 2000s that had still lessons.
Well, what was crazy, he kept a list. I think he said he had over 600 students, and I was number 6. And and what else was interesting is we found out that we were both born on the same date, which is February 12th. And, you know, I remember I played a concert with him on my 18th birthday with the Evanston Philharmonic, I think it was, and Sidney Harth was conducting. And he took me out for dinner before that. And then we got into the cars and we drove to Evanston, played the concert together. And it was I've always, all the teachers I've always had long-term relationships. And I was thinking about it this morning when I was driving back from getting groceries. In early 1990, Warren's wife called me up and said, Warren just received the American String Teachers Association award for distinguished teacher. And she said, are you going to go to that convention? It was in New Orleans. I said, yes. He said, would you mind being with Warren if he goes down there? I said, oh, it's an honor. So anyways, that's a whole story in itself. But we were in New Orleans for 4 days together, rooming together. And it was really surreal for me to think I met him back in the late 50s. And almost 40 years later, we're walking down, you know, the Canal Street going to a restaurant and so on. It was just, I still think about it, but we had a great time and he was wonderful. And he had all these stories and, you know, he just the people that I remember when I was studying with him, he came back, he was the bass player and teacher for the Congress of Strings, run by the American Federation of Musicians. And he came back, he said, Michael, I've heard a bass player I can't believe, and it turned out to be Gary Carr. And, so anyways, Gary came to the house several times there. He was there with Ward for a short time, and they had big dinners there and everything. We were all at the table. So it was just a wonderful environment. I was very, very lucky. And one summer I came back, Warren was busy for some reason. So he said, listen, you need to go through orchestra literature. You should study with somebody else besides, So he set me up for that summer to study with Joe Costafesta, which in itself was a great treat and honor also. So it was just that whole, the bass world is so close. Mm-hmm. You're always like, 6 degrees apart from somebody,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, but anyways, to get back what you were talking, after I started doing work study stuff with Rolland, then Krolik, I think it was about 2 years later, I had gone in as music education, and about the second year, I asked Krolik if I could audition to go into an applied program to get a performance degree, and so I ended up getting basically 2 degrees, and it was at that point when I was working with Rolland that the Illinois Summer Youth Music Krolik's teaching schedule at the university was changed somewhat. So they asked me if I would teach some of the classes at the Illinois Summer Youth Music where I was going, while I went to college during the summer, and I stayed there. And that's how that started. And I'll tell you one thing about Paul. He was so generous. And I remember in the back of the program, they had a list of all the faculty, and they had one other student that was listed as an assistant in another area. And I looked at my name, and he had Michael Fanelli, University of Illinois, and not as a student. And I finally had the nerve one day to ask him, I said, I'm just sort of interested why I wasn't. He said, you were teaching as a faculty member, and that's who you are. And that was the kind of person, something's falling down here. Anyways, he was just an incredible, generous, giving person. As long as you really showed you were serious about your work and everything like that, he and Krolik and a whole bunch of them, the people that were on the faculty, they were just so outstanding. And it was also an area at a time, there was a lot happening at that university, not that it is now, but they had the Contemporary Music Festival every 2 years that people came through. And I found out when I did my senior recital, I did the Hindemith Bass Sonata. In 1949, it started in 47, when every 2 years, the Hindemith Sonata was premiered at that festival in 49, and when I did it in 67, 18 some of the years later or something, it was not that far away from it. And and who else came down there and got a degree was Lucas Drew.
Wow.
Got his doctorate down there. So, and then eventually when I was down there, John Deek came through.
Whoa, that's great.
John Deek and I, so anyways, I asked Lucas, he worked with, I don't think John did so much with Rolland, but Lucas, I think, was involved in his pedagogy classes and so on. So, and that's how that started. Anyways, I was just, once I got into the applied program, I had to take a year of pedagogy with Paul Rolland's classes. And afterwards, I asked him if I could have lessons from him in terms of what he was doing. And he said, no, I don't have the time. So I kept persisting almost over a year periodically, because I was working by that time in his office and doing things. And he finally, I should say the word, relented and said, okay. And so that's how that started. And I remember, I think this is interesting because I watch your blogs every week they come out. He asked me for the first lesson to do several things. He said, I want you to go get, I think it was the Opus 2 Sefcheck. He said, are you familiar with that? I said, yes, I remember my teacher was going to have me do some of that stuff on the violin. I want you to learn the first page of the Marriage of Figaro bass part, Overture. And I was sort of, and come back anyway. So I went to the first lesson, and he did something that was just incredible. He really knew about the bass. He looked at the bass as its own instrument. And the first thing he told me, he said, we share the same nomenclature, we down bow, up bow, all the different things, but the difference between the way that we do a détaché on the bass versus that on the violin, the action is pretty much, the idea is the same, the concept, but how it's done because of your strings, length, everything is different. And then he said, let's play the Marriage of Figaro. And he had me play it by myself. And then he went to the other end of the room and he started playing with me. He said, you realize how you're delayed compared to what I'm doing? And that whole episode you had on the basses are always late.
Yeah.
So, basically for the next year and a half, I had a lesson every month. I only worked on bowing, left-hand thing, no solos or anything like that, self-check and everything. He was the one that really made me aware of the instrument's capacity as far as how we should project it, everything. Had me stand in front of an oscilloscope when I was doing vibrato to really look at where the center of the pitch was, because he said a lot of the bass players he played with, their vibrato really sort of clouded the fundamental tone, all these different things. And then he also got very much into talking with me about balance and standing, all the things that now I've done. It was just absolutely a revelation to me. So much of the things we now see in our playing with all the wonderful players all around the world, at that time in the middle 60s, it was revolutionary for the bass.
With Upton Bass, there is a lot of dialogue back and forth between Upton and the person they're designing the bass for. Here's Gary and Eric on that topic.
By the time I'm taking an order, we may have a dozen emails. We got a couple phone calls back and forth. I mean, it is extremely rare that the phone rings, hey, first-time caller, here's my credit card.
Yeah.
We've got a relationship.
Hours and hours and hours.
Right.
So Gary and I have, we've listened to you enough that within your budget, we've gotten you into the right bass the first time.
Listening is what it's all about, and that's what Gary and Eric and everybody at Upton excel in so spectacularly. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks so much for sponsoring the podcast.
How did Paul get influenced with all this? Because he is somebody like I remember watching these those famous videos of the action, and just thinking wow, look at these kids, just moving with such grace.
Yeah.
Where?
That was. Yeah, it was interesting because I was there at the start of that project. That's a whole thing. I wrote a dissertation. I'll just show it to you. I'm turning it into a book. It's like 500 pages long on his life and career. But how did he get started? Well, he was born in Hungary in 1911 on November 21st. He started the violin when he was 5, and then he had a mishap with the little violin he had, and his father just said, no more violin. Unfortunately, both his father and both his maternal and paternal grandfather all passed away by the age of 10. And his mother was a phenomenal pianist and teacher, and he prevailed on her to let her start lessons, and that's where it started. He started in Hungary, in Budapest, to learn lessons. He had a series of teachers. He said they were just terrible. I mean, he felt like he said he was playing, for most kids today to understand, but in a phone booth. It was so constricted. It was that old style of playing. There was nothing to say anything bad about Joachim and that, but it was that bent, that wrist, low elbow, so on, and things like that. What happened, he felt like he wasn't getting anywhere, and his mother really went after, and she found a teacher who was very progressive. His name was Dezső Rados, and he taught at this very famous four-door music academy, and he started, and there is where he really got into a whole new style of playing that Flesch talks about and so on. And they were influenced a lot by a German doctor who also studied the physiology of bowing, Friedrich Steinhausen. He has a book out on the physiology of bowing instruments, and he also wrote one on the piano. And that was the first time that he looked at the instrument, the violin, Rolland, and was taught to think of it in terms of kinesiological movements, as well as your physiology and your relationship to the movements. And from there, he went and enrolled into in Budapest, the Franz Liszt Academy, and got into the studio of Imre Wallbauer, who was also very much influenced by Steinhausen, was a colleague and friend of Flesch. He had the Wallbauer Kepperle Quartet, which was a very famous quartet. They premiered at least, I think, 3 of the 6 Bartók string quartets, Stravinsky, Debussy, and so on. And so he really got involved in all of the physical aspects of playing. And when I interviewed Gabriel Magyar, who was a cellist with the Hungarian String Quartet, as well as János Starker, they referred to these teachers as science music teachers, that they really looked into the body in the sense they looked at each student, they had these principles and so on, but they adapted the playing that was needed for each student, rather just the old school, you do as I say or do as I do, and that's it. And that's how Rolland got into that. And by the time that he graduated from the Franz Liszt Academy in 1936, Wallbauer was so impressed with him, he asked him to write a curriculum for teaching the violin, incorporating Steinhausen as well as, and he wrote this 70-page book called The Ideal Course for Teaching the Violin, and he started teaching there. And by that time, he also was principal violist with the Budapest Symphony, and then he also was in a string quartet that was formed by colleagues of his at the Academy. Michael Kutner, who was a violinist that ended up at the Jacob School. They came over here in the United States, but they came to the United States. And Nicholas Harsanyi, and then I don't know, in San Francisco, I don't know if anybody knows, George Baratti, who was a cellist. It was active in San Francisco, and then he ended up going to Honolulu and conducting a symphony there. But I could tell you more how they got here, but that's how all that happened. And Rolland, when Wallbauer came here in 1945 after the war, he was not allowed to take anything out of Hungary. But the one thing he brought that he showed Paul, he came to the University of Iowa, of all places. Paul got him the job there and position, and he brought that 70-page curriculum that Paul had written.
Wow.
That's how esteemed. And Gabriel Magyar said that while he was at school, in Franz Liszt Academy, Rolland already had this reputation for being sort of this whiz in diagnostic things and string playing and so on.
Wow. Okay. That's fascinating. And so Starker, so these this sort of like a diagnostic or kind of like a physiological approach to playing, like
right.
more contemporary. That
right.
they're all kind of from the same, and then made their way to the United States. Sounds like it was around World War II. Maybe fled to.
Well, he came here. The quartet, and it's a long story, but I'll make it short. They came and got a fellowship at Westminster Choir College in 1938 for 2 years, and Ferry Roth and some other people who were already in the States got them this. They played there, they were teaching there, and so on, and then they were set to go back, and of course World War II broke out on September 1st, 1939, and there was no way they were going to go back. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I write about this, all of the members of the quartet were Jewish, and obviously they weren't going to go back in there. Their families were there, and unfortunately Paul lost all of his family except one sister. And so the money was running out on the fellowship they had, so they looked at the scene and they decided trying to start a quartet up right at the beginning where World War I started here for us. And that, so what happened is that, and you'll laugh at this, where he went. He got a job through Luton Service to go teach violin and conduct orchestras at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa.
Small world. Wow.
Right. So he was there for 5 years, actually, from 1940 to 45. He also taught at the University of Iowa part-time. And then in 1945, he was offered the position to either be at Iowa or to be the chair of the string department at the University of Illinois and teach violin. He took that.
Wow. Okay.
And then
it was, yeah.
No, and then he developed, and then he developed when Rolland comes to mind these days, it's this massive impact on teaching young people. I think that we think of now, or at least I think of, or people I know. So how did he get into that then? What did that happen?
Well, when he went to Simpson College. There wasn't really a big program. So he had so many students that he had from the college. So what he did, he went into the community of Indianola and went to the schools, and he started a preparatory school at the college. And he trained students, and they started playing. It was more or less the Simpson College Orchestra was like a college community orchestra. So he was teaching young children. And he said in his classes that in Hungary, that teaching children was considered a sacred honor, that it was not like a job that if you can't, teachers who can't do, the old phrase, which I don't like to repeat. It was an honor, and the best teachers should be the ones that are teaching children. And so he opened this program and started teaching there. And he started organizing teachers in the state. And he also went around the state playing concerts on the radio station in Des Moines, and his name started to become more well-known. I met several people when I came here in '87 who knew him and had worked with him. And luckily, I didn't even think I was going to write anything. I just wanted to write an article. So I did an interview. And they said, he was a really fine violinist. He really was a fine violinist. And they remember that he was like, one guy told me, Melvin Schneider, who was a professor here at the university, said being next to Paul was like standing next to a vortex. I mean, it was just so much energy going on all the time. And they were just basically astounded. He organized the Iowa sort of string teachers conference, and who was teaching in Waterloo right next to him was Elizabeth Green. So she worked with him. And so, it was just a phenomenal amount of names of people that came through here. And then he went to Des Moines, and he saw a string class that was a heterogeneous string class, because all the classes he had in Hungary and everything else were always homogeneous classes. So that was a whole new thing. And I had access to all of his diaries and his books that his wife, Claire Rolland, who was also a great pianist, she studied with Kodai and Bartók and that at the academy where they had met. Anyways, looking at his journals was I spent 3 summers just intensively studying, and how I got to those things, that's another thing. But it was an education for me, because I could see from year to year to year how he was growing and understanding and experimenting. He would say, this worked, that didn't work. He had a list, homogeneous classes, heterogeneous classes of things that he thought he could incorporate from one to the other, what worked, what didn't work as far as he was concerned for all of the instruments. So he was constantly writing and he was having a dialogue with himself. And I think one of the first articles that came out it was in a little journal. I have it in my book here, Violin and Violinist, and it's not a print. And it was talking, I think it came out in 42, the difference between heterogeneous and homogeneous classes, and both the pros and cons and things like this. And that came out. And the other thing that was interesting about him, he had a great facility for language. When he came here, he really didn't speak very much English. Both his son and I, and some of the other people that work there, were always astounded at how quickly he learned the English language. There were still mannerisms that came into his speaking at times, but it was phenomenal. And I saw where he would cross out pages and pages. It was, he would be editing his stuff and crossing things out and then putting words, and then he would take it to maybe a professor in English or somebody at Simpson College and have him look it over and so on. So he was very aware at the power of communication, both verbally as well as discursively. And one of the other thing I thought was interesting is that I met several, they were fairly elderly, but anyways, students that studied with him at the time. And he even had in his office at the college, those acetate discs that you put on for 78 RPM, and he would record the students at a certain point so they could actually take the record home and hear themselves play, because they didn't have tapes of that yet. And he was experimenting with everything. When he came to the University of Illinois, the same thing that Joseph Matty did, he had a radio music class, string class, every Saturday. They would meet at Lincoln Hall, and he would have a class of maybe 25 string students, and they would send out all these brochures across the state, and you tune into WILL AM, and they would tune, and then he would discuss things, and the string teacher, wherever the center was listening, would work with them. He was always pushing the envelope as far as using technology and his interest in trying to find new ways to develop teaching and the effectiveness of teaching, as well as looking at, already had many photos of positions for the violinists, so much different than any of the literature that was out at that time.
That's so cool. I'm picturing back in the day, with the records, sending people home with records and doing a radio. How cool! Right. Yeah, and I love that he got this going. Folks listening, Indianola, Iowa is a small town. It's 10,000 people on a good day, and just how cool that that guy. I had absolutely no idea that was where the genesis of this started. Wow.
Right. That was it. I mean, that town had a lot. And the other thing was interesting, to supplement his income, he also conducted a choir at I think at the Presbyterian Church in Indianola. And, there's just all these stories that came out about him. And he, just some of them are really anecdotal, they're funny and wonderful. And then there was other times I thought it was really interesting. One time they said when he was leaving, the kids just absolutely, all of them fell apart. They were crying and everything else like that because they didn't want him to go. When I met him and he sat down and had lunch with me, there was something about him that he would draw out of children. It wasn't patronizing. He really wanted to know what the children were thinking, what really was basically on their minds. And I remember, when he asked me to bring in the Marriage of Figaro, at that time he asked me, well, who was my favorite composer? I said, oh, Mozart. And he said, well, that was my favorite composer when I was a child. So, he was just that way. And I remember the kids told me the only time they saw him use a lot of emotion that sort of upset them, but then they understood why. They had gone to Iowa City from Simpson College to give a performance at the university, and they were coming back, and they had stopped in the afternoon because they didn't have interstates, the distance at that time. Mm-hmm. And while they were getting soda pops, as they call it, the radio came on, and all the parents and him just stopped, and they were just shocked, I guess. And it was April 12th, 1945, and that was the day that President Roosevelt had passed. So that really affected him and everybody. And that was the only time they said they ever saw that he wasn't an upbeat and, just basically joking. He had a great sanguine sort of sense of humor. It was very low key, but he would say sort of kicker phrases after something that was just, really a lot of fun for the kids that he worked with them. So, wow. Yeah, he really communicated. And what's interesting in the book I talk about, which is a book, but also the dissertation, it's interesting because they say, well, when Suzuki came over and that Rolland, when he did his project in the 60s, it was influenced by that. This was all being done long before Suzuki. In fact, in 1947, he wrote an article for the, the Music Educators Journal. And he talked about how if a child can learn a language, they can learn by rote the violin and everything. It was the same principles that Dr. Shinichi Suzuki talked about in terms of mother tongue approach. I make the analogy that there was this one physicist in Europe. I forgot his name, a German, and then there was Newton, and they both came to the same conclusions, independent from each other. So, there was. It's really interesting because eventually Suzuki and Rolland did meet each other, and I have pictures of that. I could tell you about that, but so they were both very, very influential types of educators in their own way. And Paul never had an issue with Suzuki and so on. I think when you were asking about Suzuki, but Paul was really in the ascendancy, and then when Shinichi came over with his group in '64, with his group for the ASTA convention in Philadelphia, I mean, you have to be there. Suzuki approach just took off like a rocket. I mean, nobody expected that it would be that kind of a reception to it, But the other thing is, my wife, who played cello and eventually went into nursing, the Suzuki movement actually was already on the West Coast before Clifford Cook and John Kendall in the Midwest. Clifford was out at Overland, so I got into it and went over to Japan, but it already was starting to develop in the West Coast with teachers out there. So, but it just really took off. And I think the other thing too is Rolland died in 78, and he was 67. I think if he had lived longer, he had done from the end of the project, which I could talk to you about too, from 1971 through 78, he must have done well over 500 workshops all around the country. And he also founded the International Street Conference, or International Conference over in Europe. So I think if he had more time, he would have been more well known that way.
Isn't it interesting how people like Suzuki and Rolland, how sometimes if we look throughout history, similar, maybe ideas come to light, like you were mentioning right. Newton also, and you wonder how, maybe it's just the times or the communication or what's happening, historically. Right. Or I think that's so interesting. That heterogeneous approach, that's something I've thought about a lot as a former orchestra teacher. Like, how do you teach, concepts like what Rolland's known for in a room of violin, viola, cello, bass, or maybe throwing some trombone and trumpet in there who are goofing off if you get too much into string right. text. So it's a complicated thing. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall to see Rolland teach, because one of those there's so much like somebody who's like truly a great teacher. There's so much that you can write about it, but to actually see them in action, I mean, it's just I think that's something that
it is. I think the dynamic attitude and the seeing his mind work, and basically what he did. I remember in one of the pedagogy classes, he had a student that was a doctoral student, and they were playing one of the Vignetsky concertos, and he was having trouble with a one passage, and it was just amazing to watch Rolland deconstruct that passage all the way down to a very rudimentary kind of bowing, which he had him work on in front of the class. And for a while, we sat there, and then he basically took those layers and put them up. And finally, the next time when he got it all done, the student came and played that passage and no problem again. It's just amazing that he could hone in onto that one little aspect of bowing that was throwing off his left hand as well as the coordination on the right hand in that one particular. I mean, that's why I think if you can watch the tapes, they're now online. You can get them online. Go online. There was a Vimeo. Is that it? Is that?
Yeah, I'll dig it up. I found it. I'll put a link to it so folks can check it out.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's worth it, because you look at that. I remember when those classes started, I was working there when he first got those classes assembled. To see those students playing that way after 2 years of playing, it isn't just their musicality, it's the way that the instruments, everything. I mean, it's just phenomenal. I show that to people and they say, I can't believe it. This is at the end of the second year of their play. Now, granted, these students were really very, very involved and very dedicated. There was obviously some attrition and so on, but it's phenomenal. Mimi's wife, for example, in Indiana University, she teaches, I think, Suzuki literature, and I've got her stuff, but she uses all of the Rolland. I know probably the SAA doesn't care for that so much, but she uses all the Rolland actions and everything else. I mean, what he really wanted to do, he started the Illinois String Research Project. We should say that in 1966. First, he did a tape with Suzuki comes to the United States and basically did a tape with John Kendall and everything, where they had Suzuki teaching down at Monticello College and outside of St. Louis, and used the classes from John Kendall's class, who was a big Suzuki person. And after that, he decided he wanted to do a thing, basically bring a summative overview of all the things that he had been developing for the last 30 years. And he went and applied for a grant from the Health, Education, Welfare to do this project, for a 2-year project, developing this project. And Clara, who was his wife, was a very smart person in business and everything else, as well as a great artist. He was applying for $50,000. And she said, Paul, because she told me this, you're never going to get it. He said, why not? She said, it's too little. She said, in Washington, they think big. So she said, ask for $250,000. And he thought she was crazy, but he went in and he asked for that, and they brought him in, and they told me he got the grant. Yeah, can you imagine now, with everything that's going on, that $250,000 would be given for the Health, Education, Welfare to do a whole study on string playing? I mean, today it's money. I don't know what, it's well over $1 million. But and then they said he almost fainted, because then he realized he got to produce something here. Right. So he assembled 30 incredible educators from all around the country to work with him and so on. But he came up working with Richard Caldwell, who was a professor that designed this research study. And that's how it took off. I mean, it's 2 years of the book that came out of it, and I have it here, is The Teaching of Action, which eventually came out of that, which covers, every... It's worth getting the book just to see it, how much everything we do in our string playing and so on. It isn't way out there. It's based on things like Flesch and other things like that he had learned, but that he developed himself in terms of taking the materials and doing it in such a way that for the practitioner in the classroom, as you were saying, could read it and find it, or in the private studio. I mean, I had to read, when I took classes, all of the books by Flesch. They're great, but there's really some heady reading there. And a lot of teachers don't have the time for this. This is not a dumbing down. It's just basically a pragmatic approach to the physiology of string playing. And he was planning, this book here is basically the violin and viola book, though there's some mention about the double bass in that and so on. He was planning to do a separate book for cello and a separate book for the double bass. And I saw him several months before he passed on, and he asked me if I would assist Krolik in that, who was going to help him. And then he had a heart attack on November 9th, and that was the end of that. But now, Joanna Irwin, you mentioned, she's writing a cello book for cello bass, Rolland cello. And I am writing a book along with, I know you've met her, Renata Caceres.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
She's finishing. She's just finished basically everything for a DMA, except she has to do, I think, her dissertation. So she and I met 2 years or 3 years ago when I was doing a Rolland workshop, and she's really interested in that. And so we're going to do a Rolland double bass book, and starting with this and how that got started. What I did, and when I was at the University of Northern Iowa, I taught at the lab school. I taught was teaching children there, and I took the Rolland book and wrote when I was getting my doctorate. It was one of the assignments I had to do it for a year. Take that book and really transcribe a lot of stuff from that for the bass, and then I took it here. And I did about a 6-year sort of qualitative study on using that in teaching bass. And I really do feel it really helps. I'm hitting that one bass. It really helps in terms of bringing a natural playing position and a natural use of the body, starting with body balance, where I teach them body movement. I mean, Rolland really was into the body movement action things that were going on with kinesiology. And he was lucky that he was at Illinois, because the University of Illinois was one of the centers in the 1950s and 60s that started the whole field of movement education and kinesiology. And he was right in his milieu there.
I look forward to that book. I've thought so much over the years about how and so much of it obviously adapts to bass. When you get into I have that book. I believe that's an ASTA publication, if I remember right. The Teaching of Principles.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. And it's funny. I have a clinic I do. I'm going to do it next week called Movement and String Playing, where I'm just basically stealing from the greats. Most of it from a combination of what I learned from Joanne May and then some Paul Ellison classes. But I've thought a lot. I mean, one of the motions I love that maps so clearly to the bass, I think, is how Rolland would use tapping to hand position. Boy, that's useful. Just in terms of, and I mean, there's so much but to take it from a bass player perspective, like what you're working on, I really look forward to that.
Right. I mean, the whole thing, like I have, Renata and I did a series of tapes where there's a Rolland certification program, now 4 levels. We did level 2 and 3, and we start out just with body balance, where you basically stand. And I mean, now see, this stuff is for us, we've done this, but I remember he had us stand with our feet together, with our heels together, sort of attention, and then putting the left foot out slightly in a diagonal direction. And he developed, we actually worked with transferring weight. And I have a quote here about just beginning that, standing or sitting. I think this is really interesting, and you would find this too. Rolland believed the beginning student should avoid, and this is his words, a fixed, restricted instrument hold, resulting in hampering the freedom of movement. Standing promotes a dynamically live attitude involving the legs, which constantly shift weight slightly, the diaphragm and the back muscles. And then the seated position can be introduced later. I mean, that's just the beginning. Mm-hmm. And he really looked at body balance is the foundation. Body balance, leverage, body balance for the right, for the left, and so on. And like, I know I saw your tape when you were doing the thing with Joanne, which is one of my favorite episodes. I use the dial right now for tape. But the flying pizzicato with bilateral motion, all these things. Some people think, is that a cultish kind of thing? No, it's all based on scientific physiology and kinesiology. I mean, he got some Francis Hillebrand, who was one of the great kinesiologists. He worked when they were doing the project and everything. And it's basically to free the body from what he said, excessive tension. He said that static tension was basically our enemy that caused all these problems, and dynamic tension is what we strive for. And, he was just really phenomenal in that way. And he would come in and he would always have new ideas and things. In fact, as far as the project was concerned, he would drive some of the people that were doing the model of the project. They said, Paul, you've got to stay, if we're going to be testing this, within the parameters of the hypotheses. Because he said, I just got another thought. well, that's fine, but hold that for a while, you know. So his mind was just constantly going that way. But I think that the one thing I really do feel good about this is that he wanted to have this compendium of how to play for each one of the string instruments. And he looked at, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, as the bass as its separate instrument. He did not want you or me or anybody else to think that the bass just duplicates what's on the violin, which he said is ridiculous. And he did one thing in that first lesson I forgot to mention. I saw Thomas Martin on a tape also talk about this. He took the violin out and he placed it on a table with the button down. And then he took the bow and put the screw down at the table. And I said, look at the ratio of the string length of the violin and look at the bow length. He said, if I did the same thing for your bass, you'd have a 3-foot or more bow. Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, we're asking you. And that's what he said. I'm going to ask you to play the Marriage of Figaro beginning. I'm going to be, 2 octaves above. You're going to be down here. We've got we got to do the same thing. How do you take a bow that's this long that should be that long compared to what I'm doing with the violin? So I think that was what's so interesting about it. And the same thing I want to make a point is in his workshops, he had Murray Grobner, he had Kroll who played French, he had Barry Green. I mean, in Europe, he was not one bow over the other or anything like that. He was interested in having this, as I said, compendium of playing actions for each instrument as that instrument is needed. And he didn't want to hear somebody say, the violin, you play the bass just like the violin. No, again, it's, and I know we're and our friends out here and listening to this pod, what we have, the challenges are playing the bass. I played the violin, and I went back when I started teaching classes. I took lessons again for 3 years just to get myself back into it. And I'm not saying that violin playing didn't help me. Obviously, it did. But when you think this and the string length, the size, the circumference of the string and everything, and then the bass, I mean, it's a whole different thing, obviously. And so that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to have for every instrument what would be the most objective and basically, how can I say it, a scientific approach that will facilitate the player. And he wanted their books to be like the Teaching of Action, not to be a scientifically sounding treatise. He wanted to be written in a vernacular that the teachers could use this, but it's based on that scientific knowledge. And I remember that Starker said one thing I thought was really illuminating. And, Janusz Starker was one that always gave his opinion. It was very, he said the thing that he admired about Paul was that he based his teaching on so much investigation scientifically, but that what he respected him for was that he wrote the materials and taught in such a way that the students' humanity remained while their capacity to really excel on the instrument was developed. I never forgot that. I mean, I get chills still thinking when he said that over the phone to me. So, I mean, that's the esteemed way that he thought of him.
Yeah, I mean, his approach, from what my experience, it doesn't seem dry at all. And I'm thinking mainly like the workshops with Joanne May. It's something that you can immediately find applicable. And it's so interesting that I started on violin, moved over to bass, and then when I got into teaching, I realized how useful it would be to play violin because I got sick of going to the back of the orchestra and asking everybody to turn around, listen to like something a couple octaves down. So I started picking up the violin again and practicing every day. And I hit a point. And it was a weird moment where I was like, oh, my brain moves faster on this violin than it does on bass in a way. And I'm like 99% of my time has been spent practicing bass, but it's just so different. And, everything from vibrato to shifting to things you're thinking about, the way that the weight is going into the instrument, the bow length proportion, like you're saying. And so, it's funny. We're in the same family, but the differences are notable enough that what applies to one does not necessarily map over so neatly.
Right. No, it is. And that's what he was basically striving for and wanted to do, unfortunately, when he passed on. But yeah, he's given us a gift. And so I feel, as well as Joanne Irwin and the rest of us, that before we leave this environment, that what we have, we should pass on. And as far as my book, the other thing is I spent so much time basically researching his life. And the other thing that was unbelievable was that his wife opened the doors for me that were incredible, because his sister did survive the Holocaust, and she taught at the Francis Academy. And after about one morning, I spent a whole week with her, recording her 8 hours a day. I mean, I actually interviewed probably 90 people that were former students and colleagues and everything else, and have hundreds of pages of dialogue, which I'll never use. I mean, more than I can use, and I'm giving it to the archives at the University of Illinois. But she put me in touch with his sister. And for 2 years, I wrote questions to her about his life, everything besides his development as a violinist and everything. And her son, who she didn't speak English, her son would translate my questions and everything into Hungarian. She wrote everything down in Hungarian, and then he translated it back into English. And this went on for 2 years. And I got so much primary materials and everything about his life, anecdotally and everything else, that's partly in the dissertation, but not, because they didn't want all of that in there at the time. That now I want to share that too, and that how it formed his life. He had a great love for nature, and that, I mean, Paul was a really multifaceted individual, and complicated, but multifaceted in some of his likes and in his interest in life that he brought to his. And he also was a real foodie. He loved food. He would like to talk. In fact, that thing I told you about the Vidyesky, when I was walking out after that class, I said, when you were peeling back that each layer, I said, it reminded me of taking the leaves down of an artichoke. And he really liked that. He called that the artichoke approach. So anyways, he was just, like you said, being there, watching the tapes and seeing him. And what's sort of interesting, Jason, is his personality was, he was effusive, but though in a very sort of quiet way. He was, he'd be, there was just something about him, like I said, that drew you into him because of his centeredness and everything.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to check out this book when it comes out, and it's so cool.
We're hoping to get it out next year, yeah.
Okay, well, I will shout it out, and
book and then my book, yeah.
Okay, beautiful. I will get the word out, through all the channels. I've got one more. It's such a small world, Michael. So here's one more random connection for you. So I spent about a month ago. I spent time with Joanne Irwin's daughter, Emily.
Wow.
Who Emily is Emily Meyer. She's married to the bassist Renan Meyer, and so
oh wow,
yeah, so very small world. So I was at this institute and it was fun. I was talking to her about and what some of what we've been talking about today, and I was talking about that video series and copying what Joanne was doing. So just very small world. So Joanne has multiple ties to the bass world, including her daughter's married to Renan. So
right, and yeah, and just all the things, one of the books I just got was the quad that you had advertised on. That's incredible. And I still like to go back on YouTube and watch Hal Robinson do all those excerpts that were videotaped and everything. It's just incredible. Just incredible.
Yeah, folks who haven't checked that out, there's this great video from probably the late 80s or early 90s or something, right. like a copy of VHS tape of Hal Robinson just playing all the major bass excerpts
through each one. Yeah, it's incredible.
It's incredible. And then again, what a small world. We're talking about Hal Robinson, a Benfield student for a time at Northwestern. Right. Paul Ellison, who I think I brought up, a Benfield student.
So was Bradovich.
Yep, Bradovich, a Benfield student. I mean, so it's really, I mean, we brought up a lot of legends in the string world and the bass world, but I mean, Warren Benfield, he's one of the greats. His stamp is on the bass world for generations to come.
So anyways, yeah, so I like I said, I'll get the biography out and we're going to finish that. And then we're working Renata on getting this Facebook up. And then Joanne's will be doing the other. And we're hoping that'll bring it to full circle. And obviously, I wish he was here. Obviously to help us or direct us, I should say, but hopefully we will do him justice and finish bringing the circle together, which what he wanted to do.
Yeah, I'm sure he would be thrilled, and I can't wait for both books, and I hope to meet in person one of these days if I'm in your neck of the woods, or if you find yourself in San Francisco, let me know.
Well, next time you come to the Midwest or you're here, let me know, and we can either meet up in South Dakota or in Minneapolis or something like that. One thing I enjoyed about South Dakota was I remember when I was going up to the Lucy Weed, once I got to Iowa, the speed limit on the interstate went up, and that was a lot of fun too. But but it's a lot of territory to cover now. It's been great to talk to you, Jason, and thank you. I really want to tell you how much I thank you for everything you've done with your blogs, everything you're teaching. My joy of the week is to go online and see what has Jason Heath done this week.
Well, I appreciate it. We both have that probably researcher tendency in us. I like I'd want to talk to you anyway, even if it wasn't on a podcast, because these are all the topics I'm really interested in. So this is like a good excuse to have a conversation. And I'm so glad that Galen. Right. This is how these things work. I love that Galen introduced us, and it turns out
Galen is the same sort of mindset. Oh, yeah. She's working on a project now on the history and so on, and et cetera. And my master's thesis was on the genealogy of the bass. It wasn't on bass playing. It was just basically on the development of the instrument itself through the centuries and how it came to be. So, yeah, history was another one of my great loves. And that was a great love of Benfield's. Benfield loved history. And I remember every time we went for a lesson, before we would start, he'd ask me another question in history to see if I would know it. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I did. He said, "Oh, look that up." And he was always, he was great that way. So anyways, it's a great, great time.
Michael, thank you so much for chatting. Folks, we've got a link in the show notes if you want to check out the Paul Rolland workshops that Michael has done for quite some time. And this upcoming book from Michael, I can't wait to check it out. We'll definitely get the word out about that when that becomes available. I love doing podcasts like this. It's a perfect example of scratching my own itch. I've been so curious about Paul Rolland, as you heard in this conversation, for so long, and have thought for quite some time about how to adapt this to the bass. And so this is the sort of conversation, as I've been preparing clinics on the topic, I would have wanted to have anyway. So to be able to put this out in the broader world like this is just total gravy for me. So thank you, Michael, for the great chat. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. We're closing out August as I record these here. This is the 4th of 4. I always sit down and try to bang out 4 when I get out the gear and get out the mic and do all of that kind of good stuff. Had a good few months of travel, enough travel to be happy to be home again, actually, frankly, and I do enjoy travel, but pandemic travel adds another layer of annoyance for me personally, at least, to travel anyway. And I've sort of realized the benefits of working at home. I am somebody who, given my druthers, I would try to do the computer sort of work as much as possible outside of the house. I really do like to mix up my workspace. I've spent far too much time in this room that I'm looking around in the last year and a half. But after that, I've gotten really great opportunity to not be home for the last few months. And so I do appreciate being home and looking at my dog. I see his tail poking out from under the chair there, recovering from his vet trip from today. Gonna take him out for a little walk. I'm sure he'll be thrilled. Break out the bass and do some practicing for an event we got coming up in South Texas, and just trying to stay in shape in general. I have a funny career that involves spurts of intense bass playing, followed by intervals of not really mattering how good shape. Boy, I can't talk here today. Where my chops are at. But of course, trying to keep that blade sharp as much as possible and just have some daily consistency with the bass, or as much as I can expect, which usually amounts to like 5 times a week consistency or thereabouts. That makes it so that when I do have something coming up, I'm not scrambling and trying to, rebuild. I had many, many years, and if you followed any of my online exploits, I don't really talk about this on the podcast that much, but anywhere else you might know, I had a good 10 years where I barely practiced the bass, and I would go play gigs and be fine. I could get through it. But since moving to San Francisco, and especially since 2018, I've really tried to make practicing the bass a daily thing again. That goes better sometimes than it does other times, but I have been relatively consistent enough so that when I do have something coming up, it's not like I'm freaking out trying to relearn how to play the bass. And doing these YouTube videos that I've been doing for the last year and a half, I guess, or so, weekly videos, has been fun because it makes me learn new rep sometimes for the videos. It makes me think about a concept and explain it, and in doing so, help me develop that concept. And so that's been a lot of fun too. And I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, so I'm going to close this out and thank you for listening, and thank the team while we put these together. They are Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, and Trevor Jones. Mitch makes awesome basses. He makes 5/8 basses. 5/8, not sure, can't remember how to say that exactly. These slightly smaller basses that are still powerhouses. I love those basses. I've really enjoyed those, and he's just a great luthier in general, award-winning luthier. And check him out online, mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.